When Emperor's Children released, I, along with many other fans, were slightly disappointed by the lack of units in our codex. We didn't get Chaos Space Marine classics like the Hellbrute, but we also didn't get Emperor's Children classics like the Sonic Dreadnought. What we did get is Noise Marines, and I love Noise Marines. I think the Cacophony are some of the most interesting Marines in the entire 40k franchise. So what if I gave them a super cool Venga bus? And that was my inspiration for today. Hello everyone, my name is RHINO, and today I am going to be kitbashing a Noise Marine RHINO for my Emperor's Children army. In order to make a Noise Marine RHINO, we're starting with the closest thing we have, which is a Exorcist from the Sisters of Battle line. It already has all the instruments on it. However, it's got so much iconography, so we've got to scrape and cut all of that off. Luckily, I have a few extra bits, specifically statue and column bits from the Sigvald Prince of Slaanesh kit, or maybe it's Sigvald the Majestic, whichever one the newer one is. And then I also, on the other side, use the Demonette instrument head as like a little gargoyle. For the back, I cut off the statues and replaced them with the heads of Noise Marine Sonic Blasters to make it look like there's some Sonic Blasters there. I then start assembling the kit as normal. It is a box, as most RHINOs are. Next in the normal assembly is putting on the top of the RHINO and the beginning of the instruments and pipes. You might see that I very quickly put a Demonette into one of the gun holes. I later removed that. When it comes to the pipes, I don't want there to be missiles in them. I want the weapon to be the noise itself. So I cut off the missile heads and then take out my Dremel and drill them out. This does melt the plastic, which unfortunately makes it a little ragged and in some points causes extra holes. I capitalized on this later by making it look a little more chaosy and almost like the warp energy from the Sonic Blast has been melting the pipes. So I represent that with a little bit of rust later, despite it being rose gold, which shouldn't rust in theory. So in the end, I'm actually quite happy with the result, even though while I did it, I was like, ooh, it's a little messier than I'd like. So now that I'm done with basically everything from the main kit I want to put on, and it's just time to start adding more chaos stuff, I'm realizing that this, like, Demonette bursting out doesn't quite fit the vision I have, because while it is very cool, and Slaaneshi, I want this to very specifically be a Noise Marine RHINO, and not just a general Slaanesh RHINO. So I think I might take her out and then replace it with something a little more Noise Marine-y, and then see how that looks, because it is cool, but it's not quite giving the fantasy I want. So, once I remove the Demonette, I instead place on I think it's a normal Chaos RHINO speaker bit that's meant to be a little Emperor's Children Noise Marine-y. Later, I am going to copy this, but I should have done it now. Yeah, so this is much more kind of fitting what I want. I don't want this to be like a reclaim or stolen Exorcist. I want this to truly be a Noise Marine RHINO. So I'm gonna have to cover up that like gap where it's obvious it's been added on, probably with some more wires, because I kind of want to cover it up in a lot of wires to make it look more chaotic, because I think a lot of the thing about Noise Marines is that they are not great at wire management for some reason. So yeah, I think that's fun, and it fits the gun that was supposed to be there more than the Demonette, because you can imagine Sonic Blasts coming out of here. So yeah, let's get on to the rest of the greebling. We then start assembling the rest. My friend gave me a big pile of Chaos RHINO bits, which I was so appreciative of, so I tried to greeble it up. I put in the legs first, which I didn't have at all. I wasn't sure how I was going to do the pilot. I was thinking of maybe even not doing one, but once it all worked out, I use an old, I think it's a Grey Knight's Terminator torso, That's because I didn't realize that I had an upper torso for the pilot as well. So that was a bit of a mistake. But I use different Emperor's Children bits to, one, make him look more like a Noise Marine, and give him arms actually playing the piano. The one upside of using the Terminator is I didn't have to deal with the fact that I have no Noise Marine backpacks left, because that's been my #1 problem when it comes to kit bashing anything sort of Noise Marine-y. So instead, I've just been turning this Terminator into a Noise Marine, which works out because later I'm going to be fitting wires into him to make it look like he is actually wired into the machine. This was my first time using guitar strings as wires in kit bashing, and I would have done it a little differently now that I know how to use them better. I think I did a pretty sloppy job, but I don't dislike the final result. I just think it would make more sense if he had a lot more wires, they went more straight down, and it would have made painting a whole lot easier if I didn't have all those wires going everywhere. I then pull out the Milliput to start blending in the different stone statue parts. My final goal for this is to make it look like it is a marble statue of a rhino that is somehow moving and is going to be covered in demon flesh. So first I am mixing in all these marble bits to make it look like they are carved out of the rhino, as well as some of the flesh bits I connect in. I try filling in one of the gaps. As I said, I wasn't a huge fan of the gaps in the pipes, but I ended up giving up on that. This is when I pulled out my mold for the speaker. Again, I should have made it before going in because it's a little messier now because of the wires and some glue that melted it, but I didn't think I'd want more. But I made 3 of them. I put them in back here to cover up those bare walls, and I put one right in the front to help add a little bit more weaponry and dynamism. I also add a little bit of extra chain around the chains dangling from the gargoyle head on the side to really help move them all in. Now we're trying a new technique. This is the PVA glue demon skin technique that I learned from Fog of Gore. I didn't quite do it right. As you can tell, there's still kind of a layer of glue underneath. What happens is you take a flat thing of PVA glue and you put it in the microwave. I think my glue was too thick, so I didn't put it in the microwave long enough, so what ends up happening is it just kind of sloughs away back into an amorphous goop and it loses the demon skin texture. But this ends up looking very good in the end. And I'm excited to use this technique again, and it really helps blend everything in together, because even as it melts, it does fill up those gaps pretty nice. I then give it a gray prime, and we go onto the painting. As I said, I want this to look like marble, so I'm starting by dry brushing different grays up in a very kind of rough stippling pattern to help make it look like stone. I eventually work my way up to white. And then we move over to the flesh. So I want a lot of kind of demon flesh bursting from this. I'm starting with a bunch of pinks, and then later I'll go into reds and purples, and then back into pink. I want it to look demonic, but I also want it to look bruised and in pain, so I'm not just doing pure demon flesh that kind of stands out. But one of the reasons I went with the white instead of a pink chassis color was because I wanted the flesh to be more visible, and I wanted the marine to stand out more. I paint on the silvers with a lead belcher, which is a lot more than you'd expect, but also not that much compared to the rest of it. It's weird painting a tank and leaving so much of it white, but because of the way I had to stipple it, I kind of had to do that first. So it looks a little unpainted for a while until everything comes together. but in the end I'm very happy with it, and as I add, like, each color I add in helps complete it more and more, because I was having a lot of issues. It took me a very long time to actually finish painting this, because I would just do a color at a time, because it was such a big model, and then I just wait until the very end to do cleanup. Another thing I didn't really think about is painting under the tank. That's something I should do, even though I'm not going to see it on the battlefield much. But it's weird because then it scrapes off as I move it around, so it was still worth doing in the end. I highlight the demon flesh with some bright pink to make it look more like the color I want, as well as really show all those details. I paint in the wooden sections of the organ with some greenish brown to help just bring in another tone, and I wanted it to look very kind of old and worn. Now we move on to the rose gold. This is one of the most exciting and brightest colors on this. Is something I had planned from the very start. So all of that special filigree is rose gold. The pipes are going to be rose gold. The giant wings on the back are rose gold. Much like the Noise Marines in my army, or just all the Marines in my army, rose gold is the trim color. I put rose gold on a lot of hinges. I put rose gold in the mouths of the speakers. It's so much rose gold. For this, I used Screaming Bell from Citadel Paints. It's a very good rose gold color. It's very good for Emperor's Children. I'm a huge fan of this color, which is weird because I usually hate Citadel Paints, to be honest, but it is up there as one of my favorite metallics. It just has such a nice, pretty tone, and it applies very well. After all the rose gold is applied, I move on to add some black. This is into the pipes and undersuit of the armor. It's not a very intensive color, and I definitely don't want to be too overbearing with it. I also add it to some of the suits of the bodies hanging, including the Krieg head and the guy hanging behind. I also use it to paint the actual piano part of the organ to help make it look, you know, like a classic piano. Last step before weathering is I add some pink lines into the marble to make it look like it has this kind of pink marbling effect. In order to do this, I mix up some Power Node Glow, make it very thin, draw the line, and then take out a wet brush and I fan it out to help make it kind of look like it's bleeding through. I am not very happy with this effect, to be honest. By the end, you can barely see it, but I do think that lends to a very interesting dynamic of, is it warp corruption, is it marble, is it, you know, like scraped off paint? In the end, it has its own charm, but it does not successfully pull the marbling for me, and that might just be because of how bright it is, and it might just be because I applied it not quite right. So I definitely want to try this marbling effect more in the future, but I don't think it quite turned out here. Starting with weathering, this is where it gets really grimy. I usually don't paint stuff for 40k this grimy, but this just, it was too clean. So I pull out some Dirty Down Rust, which is one of the greatest materials ever made, and I start slopping that over all of the silver. This thing is going to be rusty. It is old. Again, I didn't want this to be a reclaimed Exorcist. I wanted this to be its own Noise Marine RHINO, and making it old and rusted and corrupted by the warp is the best way to do that. This is also when I put the rust on the tips of the pipes to make it look like they are corroding from the warp energy rather than just I fucked them up. Next is some Blood for the Blood God. Now this is a little brighter than I'd like, so I might go back over it afterwards and mix in some black to make it look like more dried blood. But I put blood on all the parts you would expect blood. The big spikes in the front, around all of the flesh, because remember I want it to look super bloody, and see what I mean? I do go over it again, but it's a little bright. So it's very gross, but it looks very fresh. So I want some more dried blood. I heard zombie gore from Two Thin Coats is very good for this, but I can't buy that in the US yet, sadly. I slop blood over a lot of things, all the corpses, all the bodies, a lot of the front, because I'm expecting bodies to, like, hit the thing. I also put some in the doorways, because it makes sense to me that the Cacophony would be covered in blood after the field and then walk back into their rhino and just drag it with them. Sometimes they may be dragging body parts or people with them. Screaming, bloody people. Emperor's Children as a faction are known for keeping and abusing a lot of slaves. I think that this is probably one way they get them. While the Cacophony often are a little less prone to this than the rest of the Legion, they still have followers, though a lot of times they are the remnants of their old serfs. But in this case, I think they're going out, they're grabbing people, and they are just tugging them into the rhino. If they actually make it back to the base afterwards, who knows? And let's get on to the glamour shots. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. Again, I've been RHINO. Alright, please like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed this, and share it. This was a very time-consuming project for me because I have never worked on a vehicle before, and this required so much more kit bashing than I thought. I didn't realize how many of the details were pre-built into the model. So, I'm really proud of the end result, and yeah. Thank you everyone for watching again. I'll see you next time.